Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Out of Frame podcast. I am your host, Sean Malone, and here with me is Paul Nelson and Jennifer Mafasante. Welcome. Thank you, guys.
Good to be here.
Good to be back.
Good to be back. I don't know. We're still figuring this out. In any case, last week, we got into sort of what we were watching and what we were kind of, enjoying on TV and stuff. This week, we've actually been completely inundated with all of the movies and shows that we're going to talk about today. So I think we're just going to get into the main meat of this episode, which is actually a pretty heavy subject anyway, about a movie called Mr. Jones. Released last year, but I think really out this year.
Early 2020.
Early 2020.
I think it was a very limited release, just kind of made the festival circuit and then was released for rental.
I imagine this is probably one of those situations where, like a lot of things lately, where it might have gotten a theatrical release had this year gone a little bit differently,
Slightly different
than it did.
Yeah.
But we all watched it. It is, it's a tough film to talk about, and we're going to get into it in a lot of depth here in a little bit. But before we get going, Jen, why don't you explain the plot of this movie?
Thanks, Sean. Sure. So Mr. Jones tells the story, based on a true story, of Gareth Jones, who was a Welsh freelance reporter, also sort of a foreign affairs secretary for Lloyd George in England. And this is all set in 1933 also. So Gareth Jones decides that he wants to go to Moscow and interview Stalin because he wants to figure out what the heck is going on over there and how the Kremlin is managing to pay for all of these beautiful and glorious advancements that he keeps hearing about on the radio and reading about in the newspapers.
He had previously gotten to interview Adolf Hitler, which is a really interesting part of Gareth. This is, again, part of the true story.
And Goebbels.
I think he was the first the first British journalist, I believe, who was actually able to interview Adolf Hitler after he had become chancellor.
Something like that.
Right
I believe
time.
The Nazi Party has really just come to prominence. Like they've only just won their first elections.
So he had made a big splash, getting this very exclusive interview.
Yes.
And so he wanted to do that with Stalin as well. But the other thing I think is really interesting that probably modern audiences don't really realize is I don't know if you guys think about the way that we think of the Soviet Union today is like this sort of failed state and crumbling infrastructure and kind of everything getting super corrupt and all of that. But in the early 30s and even in the 20s and basically after the Bolshevik Revolution, there were a whole bunch of academics and people in America and in England thought that it was the modern.
The wave of the future.
The wave of the future. It was the new society that we were all going to be living in. So
yeah, this was the ideal situation, and the Soviets were making enormous strides, and the 5-year plans were going smashingly well, and that was all of the news that anybody had access to who was not in the Soviet Union. Yeah. So all of these Western journalists were very curious as to what was actually going on there. And so Gareth Jones, the titular Mr. Jones, is also very curious.
I don't think you can say that anymore.
It's one of my favorite words, Sean.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. So this movie, one of the first things I thought about when watching it, we don't see a lot of movies about communism in the United States or anywhere, really.
Or at least not just like, hey, this is about communism, y'all.
Yeah.
Right.
We don't see a lot of that, which has always been a little odd to me because these stories are every bit as dramatic and interesting and often horrifying as any of the stories that we've seen about Hitler and the Nazis. I mean, we've seen, just innumerable World War II movies that cover, the evils of fascism from basically every angle you could imagine. We rarely see a a movie about the evils and the horrors of communism. And then I took note at the beginning of this movie. I thought, wow, we don't get this very often. Well, of course, it's actually a Polish film production company and a Polish director. I'm going to say this, I'm going to butcher this horribly, but the director's Agnieszka Holland, and financed by, in part at least by Polish film companies. And I thought that kind of scans, because it's something that for those who don't really know, Poland's experiences were, obviously everybody knows that Hitler overthrew Poland, but what people don't really realize is that when Stalin, when we beat back Hitler, the communists took over Poland.
Yes, they did.
And a lot of Polish people would tell you they were just as bad or worse. And that lasted longer.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, it was kind of interesting because you could definitely see a whole movie just on Mr. Jones and getting that interview with Hitler, and the ending being the beginning of this movie, of him sounding the alarm bells of Hitler and what was happening there.
I think that was a very important character note for Gareth, and that he's come back in 1933 after interviewing Hitler and Goebbels and saying, there is a war coming. Germany is going to invade Poland. This is bad and we need to prepare. Literally nobody else was saying that, and nobody took him seriously.
Yeah.
And what I found interesting was what set him off on this path of really exploring this 5-year plan and how they're building all this stuff is not from communism bad, capitalism good. It's, can the Russians hold off Hitler?
Yeah.
And following that path has led him to... the rest of the movie.
The rest of the movie.
So let's get into that a little bit, because I think that there are plot aspects to this. Also, I should say up front before we really get into a whole lot of this, this is going to be all kinds of spoilers for the film Mr. Jones, and spoilers for the history of Eastern Europe, actually, a little bit.
You've had your chance with that.
You've had your chance, but we're still kind of kicking around different ways to handle this show and whatnot, and there are some podcasts that I listen to and like that will do a whole sort of review, kind of a non-spoilers review. We could do that here. I'm a little hesitant to do it that way, mostly because what I think we most want to talk about are kind of getting into the ideas and the history and the philosophy and all the things that we talk about on an episode of Out of Frame, but to do it in a conversational format. So I don't know that there's any way of just avoiding spoilers for this stuff. So I guess you've been warned. There'll be a lot of spoilers throughout here.
That said, though,
yeah,
telling you the plot points of this film is not going to spoil the movie if you haven't seen it yet.
I feel that way about most movies, and I've said this. Actually, Roger Ebert had a good line. I don't even know if I can get the line right enough, but the Ebert used to talk about how a bad movie could really not be spoiled, because the things that make a movie great to watch are not really contained just in the plot. It's the performances, it's the character, it's the cinematography, the music. It's all of these pieces come together to make a movie what it is. And so, yeah, I get not everybody feels that way, but at the same time, I think you're right. I think this movie in particular would be very hard to spoil as far as it goes.
There's not really any huge plot twist.
There are no major plot twists. But getting back to the point of, what you said, Paul, was Gareth Jones was having interviewed Hitler and being so concerned about the war, as you said, Paul, what he was looking for was to figure out whether or not we could actually win if we had to go into kind of a world war situation. And we would need Russia's help for that. And so what he was hearing from everybody, from all of these different sources, this kind of seemed like Russia had endless resources. They had all the food that they ever needed. They were, within 5 years, they had radically expanded into industrialization. They had automobile manufacturing and tanks, and they were, by all sort of accounts, they seemed to be this kind of magically prosperous land in the middle of the Great Depression.
Yes.
Everyone else was
and
struggling
the rest of the world is in economic
Yeah.
shambles.
And the only
didn't make sense.
reasons why in the movie that I heard that this was working is, well, Russia's huge. Of course they have so many resources.
Right.
And
Right.
Okay.
doesn't actually
Resources. I mean, that comes up in economics a lot, right? Like, is I think people assume that countries get rich because they have natural resources, because they have a lot of land, but that's really not the case. It's really about the way that you allow people to interact with those resources or don't allow people to interact with those resources. And that's why we have examples of places that have zero resources at all, like Hong Kong or Dubai, do incredibly well, where, places with, all the resources in the world, China, Russia, and Venezuela. It's an obvious example where things, collapse. I actually do want to talk about Venezuela a little bit later in this too, because a lot of the things that made Russian prosperity, Soviet prosperity fake are similar things to what I read in the comments on our video about Jack Ryan and Venezuela. I see people all the time say, like, well, during the Chavez administration, the GDP was up and all of these things. Wasn't Chavez doing a great job? And my response most of the time is they were consuming their seed corn. So there are things that you can do to make, to goose GDP and make a country look like it's doing really well. But as we will get into with Mr. Jones,
Lies, damned lies, and statistics.
Yeah, there's a lot going on under the surface that people need to be aware of.
not very deep below the surface either.
No.
Boy.
You just gotta, fingernail scratch that. And
So again, getting back to the plot of the movie, Gareth Jones gets, he kind of cons his way a little bit into finesses his way into getting a visa to go to Russia. And it's tough at this point. I mean, already it's difficult to get in or out of Russia. And so he goes to Moscow and connects with Walter Duranty of the New York Times.
yes.
And he will factor fairly heavily into this story.
Yeah. So he is told to seek out Duranty because Duranty is well connected, he's highly placed, and Duranty can probably get him the interview with Stalin that he really wants, the whole reason he came to Moscow. Right. And, he gets there, he's put in the same hotel as the rest of the Foreign Press Corps in Moscow, and immediately cracks start to show. His visa is for a week, but he's told he's only staying 2 days and he's not allowed to stay anywhere else. And because of some conference that the hotel is holding, that you just ask another resident at the hotel and they're like, no, there's no conference. What are you talking about?
One of his friends was robbed and shot on the street right outside the hotel.
Yeah.
Yes, his friend, the friend that apparently helped him get the Hitler interview.
Yeah.
And had alluded to a big story that he was working on.
Yeah, it
is shot and killed in a robbery outside a robbery.
A robbery.
Yeah.
Right
Yeah,
outside
it is
the
so
hotel.
it's so immediately apparent that there's more going on here that the other foreign press aren't talking about, and in particular, Duranty, who is the New York Times bureau chief.
Yeah.
And we should get into how we feel about Duranty, but the backstory that the audience should know is that Duranty won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting specifically from Moscow. And this is, kind of shocking, really, in a lot of ways, because what he was reporting and what was actually true were miles and miles apart. So let's get into that. So Jones, again, immediately starts realizing that there are problems. He is hearing rumors of a famine that's happening in Ukraine, and so he figures out a way to get on a train and.
Again, there's some finessing.
Some finessing involved, and gets himself on a train, and then kind of abandons his handler midway through their trip. He's supposed to go out and see their wonderful collective farms where everybody is well
happy
treated
and working
happy,
Yeah.
for the greater good.
working for the common benefit of all mankind. And so he sneaks off the train, kind of halfway there, and immediately finds himself in a very, very horrifying situation. And it brought up something Paul said earlier, before we started shooting this, where he's talking about this movie kind of feeling like a horror movie.
Right. So the beats leading up to this, it was just these little reveals that showed that there was something not right. And as he started digging, more things started happening, and it really felt like this is shaping up to actually be a horror movie. And while we move on, it doesn't turn into a typical what you would think a horror movie is, but
not a lot of jump scares.
No, nothing like that.
But it is horrifying.
It is horrifying. Yeah. And I thought that was an interesting choice because we know the story. Yeah. We know what happens. But at putting ourselves in his shoes back then, where there shouldn't be anything wrong here, but as soon as you start pulling on some strings, things start unraveling.
So when he gets off the train, he's immediately thrust into this situation where there's red lines and there's clearly people fighting over, presumably food in that moment, and then soldiers who are there, or police officers or whoever, NKVD people.
It amounts to the same thing.
Amounts to the same thing, yeah. Who are literally shooting at people for getting out of line or for pushing or doing things like that. So he runs out into the woods, which is probably the first area for me where I kind of saw this movie and go like, oh boy, Mr. Jones, you have made some poor choices right now.
Mistakes were made, sir.
Mistakes were made because he is not well prepared for any of this. He does not have an appropriate. Well, I guess he picked up a decently appropriate coat by this point. I don't think he's wearing boots. It's winter in Ukraine. He has got to be deathly cold, and he just runs out into the middle of the woods, which being shot at by somebody, which is you never really see.
I think that's. I think other than that, that's my biggest issue with the movie is that Gareth Jones is shown to be a very industrial person that's gonna find his way to succeed, and then he's woefully unprepared. Yeah, and gets hoodwinked by children.
It is strange.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem. I think part of the aspect of lack of preparation for his trip to the Ukraine is the fact that he did pack a suitcase to go to the Ukraine, but he had to leave it on the train when he slipped.
Good point.
His handler. I think that was why. So he didn't want to raise too many suspicions because he knew what he was doing was not really going to be approved.
Right. And so this gets into some of the technical stuff about the filmmaking too, that like there are some inconsistencies, some continuity issues. So one of the things that's interesting to me is that he starts out with a camera and then I don't know whatever actually happens to that camera.
I assumed when he got taken.
I would assume that happened there too, but it's never really shown what happened to any of that stuff. But the real life Gareth Jones kept diaries and lots of diaries.
Detailed diaries. Which still exist and live in a museum in Wales in case you ever want to go visit them.
Yeah. So we know a lot of this stuff happened from not only from, of course, Jones's diaries, but also from all the information that has come flooding out of the former Soviet Union now. I mean, we have tons of access to what used to be classified or otherwise privileged documents now that we didn't have then. But I guess we just get into it. The most horrifying for me, I mean, imagine for everybody, is finding children as he goes out into the snowy woods. He finds a little hut, cabin, whatever, and kind of camps out there for a minute, tries to kind of hide, and then some children come by, and he kind of gets curious, where do you live? Kind of goes and follows them to where they live, and they feed him some food, some meat that turns out to be meat of their own brother who had died. And so Jen had done a good job of like kind of looking up what was true and what was false about this movie. The idea of Gareth Jones himself, like being sort of an accidental cannibal, was not true.
Not true.
But,
however, there was a fair amount of cannibalism going on in the Ukraine in this time because the 5-year plan that Stalin put in place was failing. They collectivized all of the farms. And bear in mind, the Ukraine, where we're talking about here, was referred to as the Black Earth region. Right. It was the breadbasket, not just of the Soviet Union, but of Europe as a whole. Some of the most fertile farmland in the world. It's
so unfathomable, I think, to like imagine where I grew up, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Paul grew up in Kansas too, where, Oklahoma, Texas, like that whole region. Now imagine that soldiers come in and instead of any of that food going to you and me and other citizens, that it all goes to an army or it all gets burned because you belong to a racial or an ethnic group that they don't want to survive.
Yeah.
Essentially. And that's
not only did they take that grain and away from the people who grew it. Soviet soldiers, the Red Army, went in and confiscated literally everything edible from the Ukrainians at this point. So this was not an accident. This was not just, the crops failed,
Whoops.
tough,
Right.
sorry about it. This was a deliberate action on the part of the Soviet government to starve these people to death on purpose.
I think one of the most, just the difference between Moscow and the Ukraine, it was so dramatic. Yeah. And when when Mr. Jones asks where this grain is going in a scene, say, it's going to Moscow.
Right.
And previously in the movie, you see what Moscow is. It's
decadence.
It's decadence. It's living high on the hog. And there's
drugs and booze and
yeah.
And you pick your favorite form of entertainment.
Yeah.
And food, plenty of food.
Yeah.
Lots of food. People who are literally fat.
Right.
Yeah.
In Moscow.
So, again, this is what makes this movie really, it's a tough watch in a lot of ways because it starts as this kind of interesting mystery thriller and it turns into seeing some of the most horrifying scenes you'll have ever seen and with the underlying knowledge that this is actually true. In particular, so some of the things that we looked up just to kind of double check, there's a scene when he's on the train where he pulls out an orange from his bag, which was, he's been on the train for several hours at this point, got hungry, he packed tiny, like a little bit of fruit, some bread, pulled out an orange, ate, most of the orange, and then threw the orange peel in the trash. And the first thing that happens is, little kids and, people on the train rush and try to grab whatever they can out of the trash. And it's kind of shocking. Come to find out that this is actually a true story that Gareth Jones wrote about in his diaries, where he was on the train actually debating whether or not there was a famine with a party loyalist communist. And when he'd put some bread in the wastebasket, people on the train rushed over and pulled it out of the trash. Really very, very much confirming that point. But that's what's so frustrating about it. But and then this is where I think we should talk about for me what is really the worst part about this, which is all of the Western journalists knew that this was happening. Yeah. So Walter Duranty knew that this was going on.
For sure knew. All of them knew.
So
right.
And so after Jones's excursions in the Ukraine, in the film, he's caught by Soviet authorities and eventually, shipped back home to Britain, where he begins to give speeches and he publishes an article about what he saw in the Ukraine. And immediately, the response is immediate from the Foreign Press Corps in Moscow. they all begin sending home and printing just absolute refutations, quote unquote refutations of what Jones has reported. Durante especially, since he is at this point a Pulitzer Prize winner, and he writes for the New York Times.
Well, it's a lot of weight.
It's a lot of weight there. So when he says Mr. Jones doesn't know what he's talking about, there's no famine here. Yeah, times are a little hard right now, but there's none of this starving to death business that he's been talking about. He's delusional. He's out of his mind.
Yeah, completely discrediting him, and really tarnishing his reputation. Where, of course, only a few years later we'd all come to find that he was absolutely correct about all of this stuff. Durante, to my knowledge, at least the end of the film says, and I think you may have looked it up as well, that his Pulitzer was never rescinded either.
No, it was not. And this decision was made fairly recently, too. I want to say it was in the early to mid-aughts of the 21st century, yeah.
Wow.
So very recently in the grand scheme of things here. But the Pulitzer Board decided not to rescind Durante's Pulitzer. And the justifications that they used to excuse that were the same justifications that the New York Times itself used to explain it, in that, it was a very difficult situation that these journalists were in. There was a lot of surveillance being placed on them from the Soviet government. All of their articles had to go through the Soviet press office for approval before they could be wired back to their home publications for printing. So that sort of excuses just the parroting of whatever the party line was that day.
I think what I found interesting in the movie is that those excuses could have been, that you could totally see them as a human being. You're being watched, you have friends being murdered, but they're shown obviously being communist sympathizers.
Yes.
And believing in that this is the right way forward. And even though I know this is happening, just give it another 5 years. Right. We'll get it right.
Well, Durante's actual line of, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs kind of really sums that up, which is that idea of like, they are there to mask any of the horrors of communism, in particular the Holodomor and what's happening in Ukraine, because they believe that at the end of this they're going to get an omelet. But that omelet
never appears,
right?
And it was this notion of,
well, it appears for the party, the selected few.
Yes, it appeared for them for a minute.
It was this notion that these are all worthy sacrifices towards the greater good, which is such a nonsense notion that it is as to be infuriating. But yes, some of the foreign press corps were true believers, and they knew what they were doing, and they were doing it to further the revolution so that the revolution could succeed. Mm-hmm. And if we don't do it, it's going to fail. Which, you kind of have to wonder, if a revolution fails because you told the truth, is that a revolution you want to be backing?
That's a very good
but at the same time, not all of them were true believers in communism. No. They just had comfortable lives in Moscow. Yeah. They were put up in a very nice hotel. The Soviets built them a new press building to work out of with lovely offices. Mm-hmm. And they had access to food and movies and alcohol and drugs and all manner of things that the average, worker just didn't have, especially outside of Moscow. So some of it was, that sort of almost religious fervor for the revolution, but some of it was just laziness and cowardice.
Yes.
And that is what I find completely inexcusable.
Yeah.
I think what kind of infuriated me the most while obviously like the starvation and stuff like that, but when at the very end of the movie, there's a reception where Walter Duranty's at. Basically, it's showing the time where Duranty convinced the U.S. to back the Soviet Unions, and that's the only way the revolution could survive. And that was Duranty's entire motivation throughout all this, is to get the United States to back the Soviet Union. And you see this all the time online about people excusing Venezuela, Cuba, China, that, because the United States put sanctions on them.
Right.
That's why they don't work.
Right.
And this goes to show, like, it doesn't even work when the United States gives you money and puts manufacturing into your country.
There's so many terrible arguments baked into all of this stuff. The sanctions thing, I've written extensively about that with respect to Venezuela, but of course, like, the United States didn't actually have sanctions on Venezuela that meant anything until 2019, which is long after their actual economic collapse. The only thing we had before that were individual restrictions on specific people who were mostly assumed to be part of the drug trade. So they were prevented from engaging with U.S. banks and the Treasury Department here. But so many of these kinds of things, like, you hear these arguments all the time. But if your great, powerful economic revolution requires trade with the United States, like, it's a little weird to say that you're like actually better, right?
Yeah.
So there are all kinds of things like that where it's like you need the Cuba for the longest time only existed as a result of aid from Russia. Soviet Union now pretty much exists as with China as a benefactor. These countries can't actually survive on their own, and then it devolves into, restricting speech, restricting movement, restricting labor, actual genocide, direct genocide. I mean, get into Mao and get into Pol Pot and all, like, and it's just time and time and time again. This is the result,
right?
And then the infuriating part is, again, we have people in the press who will just literally cover it up for decades.
Yep.
And that's like the most disheartening and terrifying thing about that whole period, is like you have from the 20s to the 40s just people saying, oh yeah, communism is great. Everything, the entirety of the sort of East Coast intellectual class is all saying that this is a wonderful system. And then only to have everybody be utterly shocked when it falls to pieces, one of the things that is anachronistic or just not factual about the movie is a few scenes with George Orwell.
Yes.
And I like that Orwell's in the movie. He's kind of used as a framing device, really.
Yeah.
He's writing Animal Farm, and so there are little bits and pieces of Animal Farm that kind of function as narration throughout the movie. And I don't think there's any evidence that we could find that Mr. Jones actually met Orwell. But they have a meeting in the film, and it's an interesting one because Orwell was a socialist, and he very much believed in these ideas. I found myself feeling bad for Orwell, actually, and not in the context of the film so much as just in life, because, like, here's somebody who I think was deeply committed to telling the truth, and he really did care. I mean, this is true. I mean, you can kind of see this in all of Orwell's writing also, but, like, really cared about being honest. And he was honest with himself about what he was seeing in Russia, and he didn't like what he saw, even though he was a fellow traveler fundamentally. Like, he wanted to see that succeed.
Right.
So I saw him as kind of a tragic figure kind of peppered into this movie, because it was like the one guy who was just, this has to be able to work.
It's pretty much the opposite of Walter Duranty.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A true believer, but
committed to honesty.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to wrap up here, but I'd love to get your guys' actual thoughts on just the experience of watching the movie and whether or not you'd recommend it. Like, Paul, would you tell people to watch it?
I would definitely recommend it. This is a story that we just don't hear in the United States. We don't hear really about the horrors of communism, especially on the big screen. This, like I said earlier, this could have been easily about a story about Mr. Jones getting an interview with Hitler, and that would have fit right into Nazis bad and, follow the beats. But this tells a story that I don't think very many people even know.
Yeah.
So I commend them for doing that. And I also commend them for really showing how bad communism is and just showing it. I think one of the most effective scenes is when he's back, Mr. Jones is back from Soviet Union. He's just walking around the streets of London, and there's plenty everywhere. There's no...
During a supposed global economic crisis.
It's like
Great
people
Depression,
are like walking around with like
whole
half
hams.
a cow,
Right.
ham, stuff
and
like
nobody
hams.
thinks anything, like everything's great.
Yeah.
And he's just sitting there like, man, if only you knew. If only you knew.
Yeah.
So I would definitely recommend it. It's a pretty good movie. I enjoyed it for what it was, but I think just for it telling a different story that not a lot of people are familiar with is really interesting.
I would also recommend this movie. I'm not going to lie. This was a tough watch for me, and it hit me hard. Like, I was wrecked for days after I watched this film and did some writing based around it. I spent, a fair part of my time just like pausing, closing my computer, and just crying. It is a very emotional, gut-wrenching film to watch. I wouldn't say that I enjoyed this movie. It's not a movie that's there to be enjoyed. It's not a pleasurable watch. But I think it is very important. This is a story that very few Americans know about, not nearly enough.
Yeah.
And just the courage of Gareth Jones to get into and out of the Soviet Union with this story. I mean, because of, creative Soviet record keeping, we don't know exactly how many people died during this year-long point in history, but it's the most widely accepted estimations are between 7 and 10 million.
Yeah.
With about a third of those being children 10 and younger.
And this is literally in the span of a year.
In a year.
Yeah.
10 million people in a year.
Yeah. And by the way, that gets to, we're talking about the Pulitzer Prize committee and not rescinding that argument of, well, it was difficult.
But it was possible.
First of all,
Gareth Jones proved it was possible.
100% proved that it was possible.
There was another journalist based in Moscow, a British journalist, who managed to smuggle out a few unedited articles in like a diplomatic pouch. He got around it that way. His editors at his newspaper heavily edited those articles and published them anonymously. Like, his name was not attached to it. But
which might have been smart for Gareth Jones.
Which would have been smarter. But,
because, oh boy, thing we didn't say.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a minute. But it was possible. It was difficult.
Yeah.
But difficult and impossible are not the same thing.
I agree. And that's what's angering to me about the journalism aspect of this story. I by the way, I second all of this. I would absolutely recommend watching this film. I agree with you, Jen, 100%. This is not a fun watch. It is not like a movie that you're going to have like a bunch of laughs and a great time watching. There are some directorial choices that I don't love in the movie, but all in all, it's a very competently, very well-made film. Actually better than I even probably expected.
And superbly acted as well.
Oh, the acting is excellent, yes. And the cinematography is great. It's really more editing choices and some strange storytelling choices. But honestly, they don't really detract from anything. But the thing that makes me the most angry, and part of that is just my own interest and background in media, is the idea that somebody would be not only well paid and get accolades in just public life for misleading people on a literal genocide, but to be awarded a Pulitzer Prize and then to have the argument be, well, he did his job in a perfunctory way, perfunctory and utterly cowardly way,
Yeah.
that is not prize-worthy of any kind. That is just being a state mouthpiece. And there's nothing that's okay with that for me, and especially in context of where somebody like Gareth Jones did actually do the work, And then this is, I guess, we kind of conclude on a downer for this part of this, but like, not only did he not get a Pulitzer Prize, he was also humiliated for several years, and then ended up being captured and ultimately, we presume, murdered by the NKVD, which is the Soviet secret police, essentially.
Like, that's not been officially proved,
no,
but there's very strong evidence to suggest
he was not in the Soviet Union at that point. I think he was in China or
Mongolia. Yeah,
and it is believed that he was captured and killed a week, I believe, before his 30th birthday.
Yes.
So he's a young guy. That's horrible downer.
Yes, it is.
But honestly, I do want to recommend this movie. I think right now I think it's just streaming, something you'd have to buy on Amazon or something like that.
Mm-hmm. The rental price is like really, really reasonable.
Whatever it is, it's worth it.
Right.
Honestly, it's really worth it. And frankly, like for a lot of our listeners, I would say actively do pay for it, because I don't know how many of these movies. I mean, very few of these movies have ever been made. And I kind of like the idea of supporting this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And if there's anything I want you to take away from this episode, be more like Gareth Jones and less like Walter Duranty in all aspects of your life.
Yeah. All right. So we will conclude here for the main episode. If you are a Patreon subscriber, and if you're not, please check out patreon.com/outofframeshow. Stick around a little bit after the break. We will come back and we will talk a little bit more about some of our recommendations. I have one that ties right into this, but is actually kind of upbeat, so that'll be kind of fun. And for everybody else, thank you so much for watching and listening. Please check us out on any kind of podcast platform, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks.